Welcome to this OSGi tutorial. Section 4, we're going to talk about provider. In this session, we are going to implement the API as an OSGi service. Following the enRoute tutorial, we will define our implementation and set it to run in the OSGi framework environment. We will look at how we can access our service and check that it is actually working. So let's get started. So what have we done so far? We created a workspace and we created an API project that declares our intention for the service. One thing I failed to mention last time, I didn't explain properly, is what is this provider type. So if you read here, the comments is basically explaining that this is for semantic versioning, and we're going to look at semantic versioning later on in this series. It's important for maintaining OSGi compatibility in your services. So what we want to do now is create our implementation of that service. We go into new bndtools project. We again select our OSGi enRoute. You can read here that we need to provide a provider suffix, and we'll do that. We create OSGi. I should type it where it should. OSGi tutorial. We implement the same package, and now the important bit, which is the provider suffix, that tells enRoute that this is the type of project, this is the template to implement, and it will know that we are looking to do a service implementation or component. So by default, you get a test class with the annotation of components already in and a unit test for you. So being a good developer, we're gonna provide a unit test for our new implementation, test get name, and we're gonna assert set equal dot test equal test implementation, and there is no function get name yet, but we are going to work on that. So this of course is going to fail. It doesn't even compile. So how do we go about this? So we want to have to implement our interface. So remember, if we're coming from a Maven world, we'll have to go and create a dependency to include the API project that declares the interface, and then we can use the interface and implement it. So to do that, we would like to do the test implementation, right? But obviously it's not in the class path, it's not available. So how OSGi is doing that? In BND project, you have to go into your build folder and you have to add that external dependency into your build path. And very easy to do. This is already in our local repo, and we include that. One thing about the BND file is you always have to save it to make effect. So now we should have that, and again, here we go. We have the OSGi tutorial test API implementing that. We get the get name, and we can implement that. It returns null, therefore our test should fail, and we'll test it right away. Run as test, and it fails. So we want to return test, because I think this is what we are testing. Yeah, so there we go, we pass. So what did we do? We implemented the interface provided from our other OSGi API project, and as far as the code is concerned, this is an implementation of an OSGi component. It's a service. It provides implementation for the test service, which provide a method called getName, which in our implementation just return the test string back. Doesn't do much, but it's a start for our wiring of the OSGi application. But so far we're not running anything. And so how do we go around and run an OSGi service? So in normal Java, you implement the public main, or you have some kind of a framework to deploy it on. In OSGi, we do have a framework, and the way to work it out is to go into the Run tab and start to define our runtime. So at this stage, our BND setup tell us that there is an Eclipse implementation. So this is our framework, and it's using an Eclipse, which is Equinox project. That's our OSGi framework runtime and the Java version. It also tells us that by default we need a provider, which is this package, to run. But it doesn't declare what else it needs. If we want to look in the run bundles, this is the dependency it works out that it needs to run our package. Now, this is not enough. We have to resolve that in order to figure out what else the runtime needs to execute. And we get to our first gotcha. After looking at that a little bit, figure out that there's this quick fix, which is to drag the calculated imports into the export packages. Now, I believe this is a bug, because I don't see why I should export a package that I've imported. This is supposed to be a provider service that doesn't expose any interface, doesn't provide anybody else with information about what it's doing. It's just saying, okay, I'm implementing this service, and I'm registering myself in the OSGi framework. Therefore, nobody else is going to use me directly but through my API. But I might be wrong. So this is something I'm going to come back to when I get an answer to, not in this episode. But for now, this solves the problem. And now we can resolve, and you can see the dependency that the BND discovered, which we need the Equinox, which obviously is the runtime, and other Felix dependency, which are some other OSGi implementations for services and so on. And we just do finish, and you can see that list is updated. We can do auto resolve on save, which means that every time I save, it will just update this list in the runtime. So far so good. We can just go and say run. Bundle description. So we should have a console now running, but there's nothing. We don't know anything. The runtime is basically encapsulating everything, and we don't have a window to go inside of the environment and see what's going on inside. And we're going to look into that now. But first we're going to fix the bundle. So we're going to go into source, and we can create a description, and we're going to say implementation of the test API. Okay. So how do we do that? In OSGi world, we can add services into the runtime which provide different capabilities. So in our case, and if you look at the enRoute tutorial, there are a few steps and two different capabilities that we're going to use. The first one is we're going to provide a shell to write commands directly to that component. So to do that, I'm going to use the gogo.shell, which is basically a shell implementation of for OSGi, and now we get a prompt. But yet we can't access our service because we didn't define any mechanism to accessing our server or to talk to our service. So to do that, we have a very simple way, which is using the command shell. It's an OSGi standard, and to do that, it's also documented in the enRoute tutorial. We define a property, and it's more than one property, and OSGi enRoute provide us with two string definition. First one is the scope, and our scope will be test. And now the scope is to make sure that there is to separate different classes or different services that implements the same function. So if we have another component, another service that implement the same function, if we don't give it a different scope, they're going to clash. So that's important. And then the actual function. Now this is equal to the actual function name, which is getName, and we're done. Now, if you noticed, I didn't stop and start anything. So let's see if it works. So the scope is test and getName, and we get a result. So this is one of the greatest features of bndtools. It's the fact that you don't have to stop and start the environment, the runtime, every time you make a change. It automatically compile your code, test your code, and deploy your code into the runtime. We didn't have to do anything. The shell was already running, it was already configured, and it's running. To demonstrate that, I can go and say, okay, let's test that to hello, and save, go again, and get name, and we get hello. So automatically everything was stopped, everything was started, and I got access. So services were automatically deployed into the runtime. Next thing in the tutorial is to use the X-ray, or to use the web API for the OSGi framework. So OSGi framework is like a server. It's running all the time. If you need an API, an admin API, you can install different components, different API functionalities, and that will give you access into that. So at the moment there's nothing running. We're going to add the X-ray because that's in the tutorial. We're going to add it in. The moment we save, we see that the run bundles are being refreshed, and here we can see that there are some stuff going on, and there's some server starting and some context, and we can look at that. But to be able to see it at the moment, it's enough to go into the local host and going into system console. User and password are both admin. It's also documented in the tutorial, and what we see is we get our provider service. That's the last component, the last service that's been started, and it gives us a little bit information about what it is. It gives you the manifest, the BND information to tell the runtime what it is and what it needs to do. So to wrap up, we created an implementation of the very, very simple service that we created, which basically just return a string. And in the case of this service, it doesn't do anything clever, it just returns a static string. Because it's running in an environment that we don't have any way of looking into it, we need to provide some kind of a way to poke it. One thing to notice, and we'll look at it maybe in future episode, is the fact that it's actually not starting anything until we are actually calling it. And we'll look at that, as I said, later. So what we did is we provided a command prompt, a command access to basically talk to our component in the runtime, and we did that using the gogo.shell. It's a feature of OSGi. We then say, okay, well, we can get to that. How about looking at the web console? And so we implemented, we dragged in the feature of the X-ray, which basically installed on a OSGi web server, and we can now look at that and see what else available. So the X-ray is here. The X-ray gives you like a graphical interface to look at what's installed and what's running, and we can see our test provider is here. So there's another way to get to it. Something's gone. Let that again. And we can see our little service. Where is it? No, that's not our service. Here we go. That's the test provider. And yeah, that's our little service API. So that concludes this episode